talk about the innovation process. Frito-Lay has reduced its product development cycle time from slightly longer than a year to about 5 months. Procter & Gamble is experimenting for the first time in decades with its strongly functional organization and is now creating business teams to speed up the process of innovation. DuPont is doing exactly the same thing. We've already mentioned that Milliken & Company has created in the last 2 years well over 1,000 customer action teams, all aimed at inventing at an extraordinary pace new products for small niche markets. IBM, another functional large-scale company, has seeded its organization with dozens of so-called IBUs, or independent business units, who have the sole charter of ignoring the product development procedures that the company traditionally follows in order to speed up the process of product introduction. A large share of renewing competitive vitality must be the ability to innovate much faster than we ever have before. Interestingly, that's at least as much an issue for healthcare and for banks as it is for the high technology companies. I want to begin by laying out a rather simple model, but one that in almost every one of its elements contravenes normal conventional wisdom. First, the given precondition. It's a messy world out there. That is, virtually everything is invented by the wrong person, in the wrong group, in the wrong company, in the wrong industry, at the wrong time, for the wrong reason, with the wrong set of end users. Just how many bankers do you suppose a decade ago would have predicted that their biggest competitor today would be Sears Roebuck and Company? I was delighted recently when McDonald's introduced its MCDLT to see that once again it didn't come from the Chicago corporate headquarters, but once again it came from a franchisee out in the boondocks. In fact, virtually every McDonald's new product has come from a franchisee as far away from corporate headquarters as is imaginable. This is the story repeated time and time again. If it's a messy world, if it's a sloppy world, there's only one way to deal with it from an innovation standpoint, and that is, and I realize this isn't very complicated advice, don't just stand there, do something. In other words, test, try, experiment, get on with it are the key words. If test, try, and experiment are the key words, then obviously we need testers and triers and experimenters, or people that we call champions. The champions, we find, to go the next step, seem to work most effectively in small, decentralized bands that we call, in honor of Kelly Johnson's Lockheed bunch, Skunk Works. The Johnson Skunk Work was a band that never exceeded 125 people in size, that over a several-decade period invented literally dozens of effective, high-quality planes in record time. Well, let me review the bidding. It's a messy world, thus we must experiment, we must have champions, and those champions must work in decentralized bands called skunk works. The management task in all this, the context of it all, is to create the climate which induces people to come out of the woodwork, to test, to try, to fail, and to experiment. That's the overall model, and now let me look at each piece of it in slightly more detail. I'd like to begin ever so briefly by talking about the messy world process. I always have a problem here, and the problem is that at home my file cabinets are stacked deep with stories from the pharmaceutical industry, from the retailing industry, from financial services, from healthcare, from high technology, and they all say the same thing that I've already suggested, and that is innovation comes from the wrong place at the wrong time. But it's such a counterintuitive notion that it's difficult to know how to convince any group of people that this is the case. Well, TRW went a long way toward helping me recently. They ran a lovely advertisement, and it featured pictures of people who had been influential in their industries in the past. A couple of the pictures in the ad that I liked best, first was one of Harry Warner. He was the founder of Warner Brothers Pictures. In 1927, Warner was quoted as saying, "Who in the hell wants to hear actors talk?" The picture next to Warner's picture is one of the head of the U.S. Patent Office. In 1899, he said with absolute certainty, everything that can be invented has been invented. In fact, that degree of accuracy that the Patent Commissioner and Warner illustrate is in general the degree of accuracy that I find when it comes to our ability to figure out where the innovations are going to come from. The only practical advice that I can give you is to take a look at your own company and the innovations that it's brought forth, to take a look at your own industry on a regional basis or on a worldwide basis, as the case may be, and to take a look at where the innovations come from. I strongly believe you should become a student of this process, and I think if you do, you'll become convinced, as I have, that the plain, harsh, cold reality is wrong place, wrong time is the magic answer. A couple of years ago, right after In Search of Excellence was published, I received a book from a fellow who is the most successful oil and gas wildcatter in Canada. He'd written the book for subsequent generations of managers who would come along in his company. The centerpiece of it was his 10 rules for management. In it, he tried to codify the things that he had learned that had been most important to him over a very successful 30-year career. Point number one, which I loved dearly, was the following, quote, "This is so simple, it sounds stupid, but it is amazing to me how few oil people really understand that you only find oil and gas when you drill wells. That is, until you've drilled the well, until you've actually tested the product, absolutely nothing has happened." Experiment, try, and test are the key words. But there's one particular subpoint of experiment, try, and test that I want to dwell on for a few minutes, if I might. And that's an issue that's a thorny one for large companies and small companies alike. It's what I call the big ends from small beginnings problem. If one has a $10 million company, usually the experience is that you won't even think about looking at a project unless you think it'll bring in an incremental $2 or $3 million worth of revenue. If one has a $1 billion company, you won't look at a new product idea unless you think it'll bring in at least $50 million worth of revenue. Therefore, we continue to focus on the grand slam home run swings, the swings from the heels, the giant projects. Well, again, that harsh, cold reality that goes along with this is that those big, giant swings usually result in strikeouts. The flip side of that is the star products, the star services, when one looks back a decade, are almost all ones that started out as small, unsung projects and turned out to be something very special in the long haul. I am the world's greatest fan of the PepsiCo company. And the reason I'm the greatest fan of the PepsiCo company is that it's nearly a $10 billion company now, and yet PepsiCo a couple of years ago was willing to invest in a 3-bakery chain called La Petite Boulangerie in the San Francisco Bay Area. Pepsi now hopes that that chain will be a 5,000-store operation by the early part of the 1990s. Typically, companies of that size won't touch an idea unless it can immediately be launched as a $50 or $100 million project. The limited stores, $3 billion strong, growing at 30 or 40% a year, 2,500 stores in their portfolio, nonetheless in late 1985 bought a single store in New York, Henri Bendel. A year or two before, they bought a 2-store chain, once again in the San Francisco Bay Area, called Victoria's Secret, a lingerie store that now they've grown to 50 stores, plus it has a burgeoning catalog business to go along with it. Despite their giant size, they were willing to take on the small, the tiny start. For the $10 million company or the $5 million company, what this simply means is taking those same ideas and reducing their scale. The products or services that will become the important ones for you 2 or 3 years from now will doubtless be the tiny little unexpected experiments. The difficulty here again is our impatience and our insistence that if we only plan well, if we only think straight, we can figure out exactly where lightning is going to strike. The brightest spot in the American economy in the last 10 years has been the burgeoning of entrepreneurial ventures. A lot of this was spurred by the 1978 capital gains tax, which in turn brought forth a rush of venture capital. Venture capital is all about, to put it mildly, big ends or hoped for big ends from small beginnings. The venture capitalist, by definition, is making bets on tiny concerns and is doing so very often in very, very risky areas. Perhaps the most thoughtful person in this whole business of thinking about innovation is a Dartmouth professor by the name of Brian Quinn. Quinn just did a review of venture capitalist activities. To his surprise, not a single venture capitalist has failed, and moreover, the average return to equity for the entire venture capital community is 35%. These are people who are playing the game by at-bats. These are people who are taking swings. And the indication is, albeit they are trying to be as thoughtful as they can be, that even with high-risk areas, you don't go bust and you have a chance at high rewards if you're willing to get those at-bats in, if you're willing to drill those wells. Now, the problem, again, and the logic that we confront when we talk about this is that in virtually every industry I know, people talk endlessly about the shakeout. The shakeout is coming. Only big people will survive. Over and over and over again, that's the story. Well, it's almost laughable. I mean, let's talk about it on a very large scale. 20 or 25 years ago, the logic was clear in the automobile industry. Probably AMC wouldn't survive. Probably Chrysler wouldn't survive because the American market could only handle 2 car companies. Well, what's happened in the intervening 25 years? We have a dozen European car companies who are in the United States doing well. We have fully 7 Japanese car companies that are competing in the United States. And as of early 1986, we now have the Koreans, and we now have the Yugoslavs, and we have the South Americans on the way. Shakeout, what a joke. The automobile market is exploding, and exploding entrepreneurially. In the same vein, in 1985, everybody said, the end is in sight in the personal computer market. Only Apple and IBM will survive, and maybe not even Apple. Well, Apple and IBM had pretty crummy years in 1985, but a little unsung company called Compaq, in fact, grew by about 75%, and its prospects are considered extraordinary. In retailing, a decade or so ago, we thought we would be by this time down to only a handful of retailers, and then the little people snuck in. Little people like the Limited, who have grown to several $1 billion in very, very short order. In the packaged goods world, only the giants, the Procter & Gamble's, the Kimberly-Clark's, the General Foods, the General Mills would survive. Well, it hasn't worked that way. In every nook, in every cranny, from the world of chocolate chip cookies to the world of fruit bars to the world of ice cream, we find tiny competitors nipping and chipping away at the hides of the giant companies, and particularly nipping and chipping away at the hides of the giant companies in places where most profit is made. That is to say, the rumors of shakeout are invariably premature, and in fact, there's extraordinary opportunity for entrepreneurial behavior virtually everywhere. Big ends from small beginnings is the key. The question that anybody of any size in any industry must ask is, do I have enough small beginnings underway at any point in time? If I'm in a hospital, do I have enough new experimental services being tried? If I'm in a bank, do I have enough new fee service products coming online in the next 12 months? And that's true whether one is a $30 million asset bank or whether one is a $100 billion asset bank. Earlier, I referred to Regis McKenna, the marketing guru of Silicon Valley. McKenna has stated it, in my opinion, very well. He made the comment, all products must be seen as experiments. The notion of the single product as an experiment, or the development of a product over its life cycle as a continuing series of experiments, is what it's all about. Big ends from small beginnings, lots of at-bats and drilling wells. And as we said, above all, that requires the champion. Whenever an innovation occurs, whether it's in an accounting procedure, a personnel procedure, whether it's in a $3 million retailer or a $20 billion high technology company, whenever an innovation occurs, almost invariably, a persistent, determined, committed, irrational, erratic, royal pain in the neck on their good days champion was involved in the process. And when you think about it, it makes extraordinary sense. What is the definition, plain and simple, of an innovation? An innovation is something that makes everybody mad. An innovation makes the people in manufacturing or operations furious. An innovation makes the purchasing department furious. An innovation, because of its uncertainty and ambiguity, drives the controller absolutely nuts. The customers don't even like it because they don't know what to do with it. The champion, by definition, is confronted with a whole bunch of people who basically hate his or her guts, and if you're going to persist against the odds, you've got to be a little bit wacky. Peter Drucker said it beautifully years ago, looking back on a 70-year exciting career in virtually every walk of life imaginable, public and private. His comment, whenever anything is being accomplished, it is being done, I have learned, by a monomaniac with a mission. Monomaniacs, by definition, are pretty unpleasant much of the time, but you got two choices. Put up with the unpleasant monomaniacs or go out of business and die. I'm not suggesting that this whole model of innovation that I'm proposing is a very fun model. It would be lovely if we could have tidy forecasts that would allow us to tell where innovations were going to come from. It would be lovely if we could have nice, plain, vanilla, mild, meek people who would bring the innovation home in accordance with a 300,000 bubble PERT chart or milestone diagram. The real reality, though, is innovation is about serendipity, at-bats, tries, ambiguity, uncertainty, madness, irrationality, persistence, craziness, stumbling blocks and barriers put up in the way of people, and so on. As a good friend of mine said, you can always tell the pioneers. They're the ones who are lying in the path in front of you, face down with the arrows in their back. Yep, that's what it's like to be the monomaniac with a mission. Most of them don't survive. Most of them are a pain in the neck, but you gotta love them if you're serious about innovating. I recently came across a story about the development of a new supercomputer. You think about supercomputers, those are the most giant computers of all, and you immediately think about multi-hundred or multi-thousand person project teams involved over a period of decades in their development. Well, this was a supercomputer that was developed at Lawrence Livermore Labs. It basically got developed there by a large team, 2 people. And the reason they had to develop it is because the process was too complicated and too awesome for the IBMs to take on. The boss of the project commented on the 2 people who had developed it as follows. Kurt and Tom were considered off-the-wall crazy because it was well known that the big computer companies would have done it if it had been possible. The fact that it hadn't been done meant that it was foredoomed. They were absolutely wasting their time. They got an enormous amount of ridicule. Just because people say you're crazy doesn't mean you're going to win, but sometimes it sure looks like a necessary condition for success. Amen is the only answer that I can give to that. I said before that the next step in our logic suggests to us from all sorts of experience, again from companies of all sizes and industries of all sorts, that these champions tend to work best as parts of small teams and small team operations. It's the notion of the skunk work, the team that has all the primary functions represented, that usually doesn't number more than a dozen or 2, even in the large project area. Well, the model of the skunk work is, of course, the original one that Kelly Johnson developed at the Lockheed Corporation. The Johnson story is an exceptional one, to put it mildly. Kelly worked at Lockheed for 44 years. The first day on the job, Kelly told the Lockheed Corporation, as a young, fresh-caught engineer in his early 20s, that the major plane that they were designing was the stupidest design he'd ever seen in his life. In 9 out of approximately 9 companies, Johnson would have been fired. By random chance, Lockheed didn't fire him, and it's probably the best decision that company's ever made in its long history. Johnson, on 41 separate occasions, developed fully complete working prototype products. And let's take a look at the typical situation in which Johnson was engaged. At one stage of the game, he was called in to bail out the ailing Agena D rocket process. When he arrived, it had a magnificent reliability score of 13%. Well, Kelly went to work. In short order, he reduced the number of working drawings on the project from 3,900 to 350. He reduced the number of quality control personnel from 1,206 to 69. He reduced the projected tooling costs from over $2 million to $150,000. He took the remaining 18-month schedule and halved it down to 9 months. In the process of doing all these things, and along the way, he increased the reliability from 13% to 96%. And then at the end of the 9 months, you can guess the outcome. He gave the government $50 million back on the contract that they had awarded him. This was typical of the Johnson process. At another point, he developed the U-2. The government gave him a massive contract to build 20 U-2s. He cut the time in half, He built 26 instead of 20, and then he gave him 15% of the contract cost back at the end. Just what we're all used to hearing about in the weapon systems development arena. The Kelly Johnson story is repeated from Campbell Soup to Bank One in Columbus, Ohio, to virtually every industry that I've come across. The turned-on team, the turned-on band, the band committed to its project or process is able to do the job in a 10th of the time or a 20th of the time at higher quality. Our logic then goes as follows. We said messy world, lots of tries, crazy nutty champions, working together in small turned-on teams. And then that leaves us with that management task, creating that innovative environment. The word that I've come to like best is the notion of being impatient. Purposeful impatience, I call it. Or another way of looking at it is what I call management modeling innovation. Management going consciously out of their way to reinforce the point that we're in a hurry, we got to get going, we can't put up with bureaucratic hurdles and bureaucratic nonsense. And the story that illustrates that best for me is one that I heard from several people surrounding the development of the convertible at the Chrysler Motor Company. Lee Iacocca got it into his head that he wanted a convertible. He thought it was a good idea. So he did exactly what you're supposed to do when you have an idea like that. He went to the head of engineering and he said to the chief engineer of the Chrysler Corporation, he said, I'd like to get a convertible developed. Well, the head engineer said exactly what you would expect the head engineer to say to the chairman of the board. First, he said, yes, sir. And the second words out of his mouth, consistent with conventional wisdom, is he said, we can have one for you in just about 9 months. Iacocca turned slightly purple with rage, turned around to the chief engineer and said, no, you do not understand. Take a car and saw the top off the damn thing. And saw the top off the damn thing they did. Then Iacocca conducted some very systematic and substantial market research. With his new convertible car, he drove around the city of Detroit, and he counted the people who waved to him. When the number of waves got high enough, he said to his people, build it. And in fact, along with the K car, the convertible has perhaps been the most successful Chrysler product during the Iacocca reign. The point is, purposeful impatience, not putting up with the bureaucratic nonsense, getting on with the test it, try it mentality as quickly as one can. Another piece of this is direct, purposeful defiance of the rules that you yourself have made. Amongst the large companies, there couldn't be anybody more innovative than the Hewlett-Packard Company. Well, Hewlett-Packard, despite their extraordinary efforts to stay innovative, knows that even they are too bureaucratic. And so recently I came across a wonderful certificate, a certificate that was awarded about 4 years ago to one of their senior engineers. It's bright red, it has the Hewlett-Packard logo at the top, and the wonderful title of the certificate is Medal of Defiance. The words underneath it say, awarded to Charles H. House in recognition of extraordinary contempt and defiance beyond the normal call of engineering duty. In total defiance of adverse market studies and surveys, concluding the existence of a worldwide market of no more than 50 large-screen electrostatic displays, House, using all means available to extol an unrecognized technical contribution, planted the seeds for a new market resulting in the shipment of 17,769 large-screen displays to date. The date of the certificate is April 1, 1982. It was awarded to House by the chairman of the board of the Hewlett-Packard Company, David Packard. Test, try, and get on with it, by definition, means lots of failures along the way. And the suggestion I have is radical. The suggestion I have is support for failure, lauding failure, praising failure, giving prizes for interesting failures. Now, let me make it entirely clear. I don't mean an unplanned, thoughtless, sloppy error. What I do mean is the thoughtful try that, in fact, came across the complexity of the real world, didn't work out as we had planned, but allowed us to learn something on the way. Nonetheless, that is a failure. Well, people who have thought about it include a fellow who I've done some work with in Silicon Valley who has a very successful computer peripherals company. The following phrase is not something that he uttered after a third martini. In fact, it's part of the formal, written philosophy statement of his organization. He says, "We tell our people to make at least 10 mistakes a day. If you don't make at least 10, you're not trying hard enough." That's the end of the statement. I might add that what's particularly important to me is that this is about a $10 million company, because one of the things I often hear from people in small businesses is, well, we're not AT&T, we're not Sears Roebuck, we can't afford to make mistakes. Well, if you believe that, you're ignoring all of the story that I've told so far. What I'm simply saying is that it's a messy, sloppy world. Along the process of developing a product or service and bringing it to market, you will learn a million things, and you will learn them the hard way. The question is, will you learn them at the end of 18 months and a lot of paper plans, or will you learn them at the end of 90 days after you've actually tried the thing in the real world? If you're going to speed up the pace of innovation in a $1 million company or a $20 billion company, you must tolerate, laud mistakes. In fact, the fellow trying to turn around a large company commented recently to all of his senior marketing people. Quite simply, he said, "We need to make our mistakes faster." And there's incredible brilliance in that statement. Faster indeed is what he needs. I previously mentioned Brian Quinn, the Dartmouth professor who comes in at the very top of my list as thoughtful people on the topic of innovation. Quinn wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review that won an award, in fact, titled "Managing Innovation, Controlled Chaos." First, I think his term controlled chaos is indeed a lovely one. But in it, he talked about the primary barriers to innovation and also the things which foster innovation. The barriers which he mentioned were these: top management isolation. Number 2, and my favorite of the list, as you might guess, intolerance of fanatics. Number 3, short time horizons. Number 4, conservative accounting practices. Number 5, excessive rationalism. Number 6, excessive bureaucracy. And number 7, inappropriate incentives. The success factor list, which he unearthed in his several years of study, included the following: atmosphere and vision, orientation to the market, small, flat organizations, multiple approaches, and skunk works. I guess there was a single sentence in Quinn's article that struck me as most profound. And before I tell you what it is, let me just say a couple of words about Quinn. Sometimes I get a little bit worked up about what I'm talking about. Quinn is a serious, quiet, sober, scholarly researcher. For 30 years, Quinn has researched nothing but innovation at GE, at Xerox, at Bell Labs, at IBM, in the raucous small company world of Route 128 outside of Boston, and so on. And yet Quinn, after 30 years of patient, meticulous research, concludes, quote, "My research reveals that few, if any, major innovations result from highly structured planning systems," unquote. That, to me, is a frightening conclusion. At bats, tries, drilling wells, big ends from small beginnings, crazy champions, medals of defiance, cut the top off the damn thing, get on with it, are the watchwords. Everything that I am saying is doubtless terrifying. It suggests that we have to set conventional wisdom on its head. We're not going to innovate fast enough to survive as a small-town banker or as a high-roller, high-technology company unless we speed up the pace of change. And it's my observation that there is only one alternative, and the alternative is the one that I've laid out here. At bats, tries, nutty champions, small bands of skunks, and medals of defiance. Let's get on with finding and celebrating our heroes and begging them to make their mistakes ever faster.